The house had learned to stay quiet around her. It carried a kind of controlled stillness, the kind that settles after months of holding breath. Lena moved through it each morning as if performing a duty rather than living inside it, touching as little as possible, keeping the rooms exactly as they were on the day the world split in two. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the strong coffee her husband used to brew at dawn, though she no longer prepared it. The curtains in the hallway remained half-drawn, because he had last adjusted them, and she couldn't bring herself to disturb the fold his fingers had left behind. Even the dust on the bookshelf felt arranged in a pattern she wasn't entitled to change. But nothing in the house demanded more silence than the closet in their bedroom, a simple wooden door with a brass handle, nothing remarkable from the outside. Yet she moved around it, as though the door radiated heat. She had closed it gently the day after the funeral, her hands trembling, and since then she had treated it like a sealed room, a place forbidden not by rules, but by the weight of a life she wasn't ready to reopen. Shirts, jackets, hiking boots, the smell of cedar from the cubes he always insisted on keeping between sweaters. Everything remained untouched behind that door. She used to press her forehead against it at night when sleep wouldn't come, but even that ritual had stopped after the ache became too sharp. It had been 8 months. People spoke to her about time, about healing, about rediscovering routine. She nodded, thanked them, and went home to the same hollow rhythm. She worked remotely, avoided visits, ate whatever required the least effort. The mailbox sometimes stayed full for days. On weekends, when silence grew too dense, she walked around the neighborhood, keeping her head low to avoid casual sympathy. Returning to the house always felt like walking back into cold water. The dog arrived by accident, or at least that was how she explained it to herself. A neighbor had found the golden mutt, wandering between driveways after a storm, and mentioned it while Lena stood outside retrieving packages. The dog followed her up the steps without hesitation, shaking water onto her jeans, pressing its wet nose against her hand as though it recognized her. She tried ignoring it, but the animal waited on her porch for hours, tail lowered but hopeful. Rain came again that evening, falling in restless sheets across the yard. She watched from the window, arms wrapped around herself, telling her brain that the dog surely belonged to someone else. But when thunder cracked and the animal pressed itself against her door, trembling in the downpour, she finally opened it. She didn't name him. She didn't intend to keep him. She placed an old towel on the floor and filled a bowl with water, assuming he would be gone by morning. Instead, he slept curled by the couch, breathing softly, and when she woke up hours later, he was lying near her bedroom doorway. He stayed close to her shadow all day, following without intruding, settling wherever she stopped. When she sat at her desk, he stretched out by her feet. When she made tea, he waited near the cabinets as though anchoring the room. His presence was quiet, unassuming, almost apologetic. She found herself speaking to him in short murmurs, though not in full sentences, never anything that felt like acknowledgement. He was not her husband's dog. They had talked about adopting one, but always postponed it for later, for after the renovation, after work slowed down, after life felt more stable, after never arrived. She reminded herself of this whenever the dog lay beside her on the couch, observing her with attentive but ordinary eyes. There was nothing mystical about him. He didn't sense her grief with uncanny precision. He simply lingered near warmth. And yet, he kept choosing her. Days settled into a hesitant coexistence. She accepted his company the way one accepts sunlight through a window, without inviting it, but without pushing it away. She bought food, washed his bowl, brushed leaves from his fur after he rolled in the yard. The small tasks didn't feel like care so much as maintenance, a neutral arrangement. Still, the silence in the house shifted, not louder, just less sharp. Sometimes she caught him staring at the closed closet door, not in a dramatic way, not as though he sensed meaning. He looked the same way he looked at any closed space, curious and still. Yet the sight of him sitting there, head angled slightly, unsettled her in ways she couldn't articulate. She redirected him with a gesture, avoiding the door even more than before. One cold morning in late autumn, she woke before sunrise, the air brittle against her skin. The dog wasn't at his usual spot by the bedroom threshold. She found him in the living room, pacing from wall to wall with an energy he had never shown inside the house. His nails clicked against the floor in a restless pattern. He kept glancing down the hallway, ears slightly raised. She tried distracting him with food, but he ignored the bowl, trotting back toward the bedroom. Something about his insistence pressed against her nerves. She followed him reluctantly as he led her to the foot of the bed, then toward the closet door. He sat down beside it, tail sweeping once across the floor, eyes steady on the handle. She stood frozen, her hand tightening around the edge of her sweater. The dog didn't whine or paw at the door. He simply waited, breathing in slow, even rhythms, as though this was just another quiet morning. But her body reacted as if to a threat. Her chest tightened, her throat constricted, and her fingers tingled. She whispered a sharp breath, stepped back, and walked away, retreating to the kitchen. The dog followed only halfway, then returned to his position by the door, settling into an obedient stillness. Hours passed. She tried to work but couldn't focus. Every noise from the hallway knotted her stomach. She found herself washing dishes that were already clean, wiping the counter repeatedly, reorganizing a drawer she seldom used. Each task dissolved in her hands. Eventually she sat on the floor of the living room, legs pulled tight, while the dog remained in the bedroom, silent and patient. By afternoon, exhaustion sank into her bones. She made tea she didn't drink and stood at the sink staring at the garden, its dead leaves scattered across patches of frost. The dog padded quietly into the room, rested his head against her knee, and waited. She exhaled, long and unsteady, and placed a hand on his back, not out of intention but because gravity seemed to pull her palm there. When she finally walked back toward the bedroom, her steps were slow, almost dragging. The dog moved beside her, brushing against her leg like a grounding weight. She stopped in front of the closet, her breath shallow, her pulse ticking loud in her ears. Her fingers hovered above the brass handle, but she couldn't close the gap, couldn't touch the metal that held 8 months of everything she had avoided. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she turned away, pressing her hand to her sternum as though holding something in place. The dog sat again at the exact spot, not demanding, not urging, simply filling the space with steady presence. And for the first time since she closed that door, she realized she was no longer alone inside the silence she had built. The night arrived early, heavy and windless. She left the closet untouched, but its presence lingered in every room, following her like a shadow she had tried too long to outrun. The dog slept at the foot of her bed, breathing softly, while she lay awake listening to the quiet, feeling something shift inside her, small, almost imperceptible, like the faint crack of ice beginning to thaw. The next morning carried a dull grey light, the kind that blurred edges and made every room feel suspended in time. Lena woke with a stiffness she couldn't place, part fatigue, part dread that traced back to the untouched door across the room. The dog lay curled near her dresser, lifting his head the moment she shifted. His tail thumped once against the floor, a soft reminder that another day had arrived, whether she felt ready for it or not. She moved through her routine with a mechanical slowness. She washed her face, tied her hair, stepped into the kitchen and boiled water she barely tasted in her tea. The dog followed a few paces behind, giving her space but not distance. She tried to ignore how often her eyes drifted down the hall, always landing on the shadowed doorway of the bedroom, where the closet waited like a dormant storm. She worked for several hours, the screen glowing in front of her without making sense. Notifications went unanswered. Emails remained open and empty. By noon she had given up pretending, closing the laptop and resting her forehead on her arms. The house felt small, pressing inward, as though the walls had grown tired of carrying the tension she refused to release. The dog approached, nudging his nose gently against her elbow. He didn't linger when she didn't respond. Instead, he wandered away, paws making soft taps across the floor. She could tell when he reached the bedroom because his footsteps stopped, replaced by a silence thicker than before. She imagined him sitting there again, eyes fixed on the closet door, patient in a way she didn't want to understand. She found him later lying in the hallway just outside the room, body stretched long across the carpet. Something rested between his paws, something small and soft. For a moment she thought it was one of the toys she'd bought impulsively during a grocery run weeks ago. But as she approached, her breath caught in a sharp, involuntary inhale. It wasn't a toy. It was a sock. Faded navy blue worn along the heel, a thin thread unraveling near the cuff. A sock she recognized instantly because she had folded its pair the night before her husband left for that last business trip. He'd dropped it while packing, and she had promised to find it later. She never did. She assumed it was lost in the abyss beneath the bed or tangled with old linens. She never imagined it had been inside the closet all this time. She knelt slowly, her balance wavering. The dog lifted his head, watching her without expectation. She reached for the sock with trembling fingers, but the moment her skin brushed the fabric, something inside her recoiled. She pulled her hand back abruptly, pressing it against her chest as though she had touched something scorching hot. The dog didn't move the object toward her again. He didn't push it, didn't insist. He simply rested his chin on his paws, his eyes flicking gently between her and the sock, as if acknowledging that it now existed in the space between them and could no longer be ignored. She sat on the floor beside him, legs folded awkwardly, shoulders tightening with each breath. The sock lay inches from her knee, small and ordinary, but heavier than anything she had touched in months. She stared at it until her vision blurred. The room thickened with memory, her husband tying his shoes, laughing softly when she complained about his mismatched socks, leaving trails of clothing when he rushed to catch the morning train. None of it came as a vivid replay. It arrived instead as a pressure behind her ribs, a tightness that built slowly, threatening to spill over. She tried to stand, but her legs refused. So she stayed there, breathing unevenly, waiting for the pressure to recede. The dog shifted closer, his warm body brushing her hip. She didn't lean into him, but the touch anchored her enough to keep her from dissolving completely. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually she reached out again, fingers steadying just enough to lift the sock from the floor. The fabric was cold. She turned it over in her hands, smoothing its creases, tracing the faded elastic. It felt wrong how intact it was, how unchanged, how quietly preserved. As though time inside that closet had never moved. She rose with the sock clenched loosely in her hand and walked into the bedroom. The dog followed but stopped at the threshold, settling into a waiting posture that seemed instinctual rather than directed. She stood before the closet door again as she had the day before, but this time something in her posture shifted. Her shoulders lowered, her breathing slowed, still fragile, but not paralyzed. Her thumb brushed the brass handle. She didn't turn it. The weight of the action still loomed too large. Instead, she pressed the sock gently against the wood, resting it there as though returning it to the place it came from. Her forehead lowered until it touched the cool surface beside it. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply stayed there, breathing, feeling the grain of the wood against her skin, acknowledging the distance between who she had been and who she was now. When she stepped back, she carried the sock with her instead of leaving it behind. She placed it on her nightstand, smoothing the fabric once more before walking away. For the rest of the day, she avoided the bedroom, drifting between rooms with a numbing sort of purpose. Every object felt newly weighted, connected to something she had been trying not to feel. The dog shadowed her lightly, curling near whatever spot she settled in, never too close, never too far. Later that evening, she caught her reflection in the window, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes dim but no longer empty. She realized she was exhausted in a way that felt honest, not hollow. When night fell, she returned to the bedroom. The sock waited on the nightstand like a quiet truth. She sat on the edge of the bed, tracing its uneven stitching. The dog circled once before lying at her feet. She didn't touch the closet door, not yet. But for the first time, she didn't avoid looking at it. She allowed her gaze to rest on it for a few seconds, long enough to feel the pull of something shifting, something loosening deep inside the quiet she had lived in for far too long. She turned off the light and lay down. The dog's breathing filled the room. The sock remained beside her, small and steady, a piece of the past that had somehow found its way back into her hands, carried not by memory, but by a creature who only understood warmth, scent, and instinct. The night felt different. Not easier, just different. The next days unfolded with a strange, hovering tension, as though the house itself sensed that something buried had shifted. Lena tried to slip back into her old rhythm, but nothing settled the way it used to. The sock on her nightstand pulled at her attention every time she passed the bedroom door, its presence small but undeniable, like a light left on in a distant room. She didn't touch it again, though her fingers often twitched toward it before she caught herself and walked away. The dog kept close, more watchful than before, though never demanding. He spent long stretches lying in the hallway, his body angled toward the bedroom, ears tilting whenever she entered or left. Sometimes she found him sitting quietly beside the closet door again, his posture relaxed, not alert. It wasn't insistence, just a strange, steady familiarity, as though he had simply mapped the house and found that corner to be part of its heart. She avoided the bedroom during the day, working on the couch, eating in the kitchen, drifting through rooms she barely noticed. Her movements became sharper, more restless. She opened drawers she didn't need to open, cleaned surfaces that didn't need cleaning, revisited tasks she had already completed. Anything to keep her hands busy. Anything to keep her mind from circling the same point she had been orbiting for months. Her sleep grew fractured. She woke often, sometimes breathless, sometimes disoriented, sometimes with her hand pressed unconsciously to the nightstand as though reaching for what she wasn't ready to face. Each time she woke, the dog lifted his head, blinked slowly, and lowered it again once she settled. She found comfort in the rhythm of his breathing, even when she tried not to. 3 mornings later, something felt different the moment she opened her eyes. Not brighter, not lighter, just clearer. The air carried the faint scent of winter rain, the kind that seeps into the ground before the storm fully arrives. The dog was sitting near the window, watching the muted sky. When she sat up, he turned toward her with a quiet, expectant calm. Her gaze drifted to the nightstand. The sock lay exactly where she had left it, its presence no longer sharp, but quietly solemn. She picked it up without thinking, turning it over in her hands. The fabric didn't sting this time. It only felt soft, worn, lived in. She held it for a long moment, before setting it down again. The dog rose and walked to the bedroom doorway, stopping halfway and looking back at her. She hesitated, pulse tightening. He didn't move again until she stood. When she did, he walked slowly down the hall, pausing outside the closet as though settling into a familiar spot. She stopped a few feet away, every part of her tensing reflexively. She stared at the door, her breath held in a shallow, wavering pattern. Her hand rose, then fell, rose again, then hovered. The urge to flee surged through her like a cold ripple. She stepped back quickly, almost stumbling. The dog lifted his head slightly but didn't follow. She moved into the bathroom instead, splashing cold water on her face until her skin tingled. She gripped the counter, shoulders shaking, not with tears but with the heavy, suffocating frustration of someone trapped by their own resistance. She whispered a sound, not words, just a low, cracked breath that felt pulled from somewhere deep. By afternoon, the storm arrived. Rain slapped against the windows in relentless sheets. The wind pushed against the house with a restless, uneven rhythm. The dog grew unsettled, pacing from room to room, occasionally stopping near her as though gauging her calm. She felt trapped and weightless at the same time, unable to focus on anything, her thoughts drifting in restless circles. When the power flickered and went out briefly, the house sank into a darker quiet. She lit a small lamp in the living room and sat on the floor beside it, knees pulled up, hands interlocked behind her head. The dog rested beside her, leaning gently against her thigh. His warmth seeped slowly into her skin, grounding her in a way she didn't expect. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. The storm softened eventually, turning from violent to steady. The air smelled like wet earth and cold wind. She pushed herself up, legs numb, and walked back to the bedroom without fully realizing where she was going. The closet door stood in the dim room, its edges softened by the fading light. She stood before it again, close enough to touch the wood but still holding herself back. The dog sat behind her this time, not at the door. His presence felt quieter, steadier, less like a guide and more like a witness. Her hand rose once more, but she couldn't make contact. Instead, she stepped to the side and sat on the floor, leaning her back against the bed frame. She rested her head on her knees, breathing slowly through the growing ache in her chest. She stayed like that until her breathing evened out again. She didn't open the closet. She didn't even touch it, but she didn't run from it either. That night, when she crawled into bed, exhaustion weighed her limbs like wet sand. She reached for the sock again, curving her fingers loosely around it. She felt the dog settle at his usual spot, his breathing a slow, steady tide. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since her husband's death, she let herself feel the shape of the grief, rather than trying to shrink away from it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming. It just sat there with her, quiet and solid, like a presence she had finally stopped pretending she could outrun. Outside, the storm faded into a calm, stretched-out night. The next morning arrived with a washed-out sky, the kind that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. The storm had left the yard littered with branches and soaked leaves, and the cold felt sharper than the day before. Lena woke with her cheek pressed against the pillow and the sock still in her hand, its fabric creased against her palm. She blinked at it for several seconds before setting it gently back on the nightstand. The dog stood at the foot of the bed, stretching slowly, his ribs rising under his fur. When she sat up, he trotted toward the hallway, pausing to see if she would follow. She didn't, not immediately. Her body felt heavy, as though sleep had sunk too deeply into her bones. She rubbed her eyes, took a long breath, and forced herself to rise. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and cold air seeping in through unseen cracks. She opened a window slightly to let in the morning, but the breeze carried a chill that made her sleeves tremble. She boiled water, watched steam coil from the kettle, and made tea she barely tasted. The dog lay near the doorway, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive. Her thoughts floated, drifting around the edges of something she still couldn't bring herself to face. The closet door lingered in every room, even when she couldn't see it. When she closed her eyes, she found herself imagining the stillness inside it, the untouched shirts, the scent of cedar, the coat he wore every winter, stored neatly on its hanger. She couldn't decide if the thought brought comfort or nausea. By midday, she felt restless again. The house, so small in its silence, pressed against her. She stepped outside for the first time in days, pulling on an old jacket that still smelled faintly of detergent from months ago. The air was cold and sharp, the ground damp beneath her shoes. The dog followed closely, his paws sinking slightly into the softened earth. The walk should have cleared her mind, but instead it stirred the quiet tension she'd been trying to manage. Every step felt like wading through heaviness. She noticed the neighbor across the street pulling branches off their lawn. They lifted a hand to greet her, but she pretended not to see. She wasn't ready for small talk, for sympathy disguised as kindness, for well-meaning questions she couldn't answer. The dog occasionally trotted ahead, nose low, tail swaying in slow arcs. At one point he stopped near an old birch tree and turned back toward her, as though checking whether she was still following. She didn't approach him. Instead, she crouched several feet away, running her fingers through cold grass, grounding herself in the rough texture. When she finally stood, she realized her hands were trembling. Back inside, the house felt even colder. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat on the living room floor, knees pulled up, staring at nothing in particular. The dog lay beside her, curling himself into the small space between her hip and the couch. She rested her hand on his back, barely applying pressure, just enough to feel the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Time passed without a sense of direction. Afternoon faded into evening. The sky dimmed. It was when she rose to take a glass of water back to the kitchen that it happened. She turned the corner toward the bedroom and froze. The closet door was cracked open, not wide, just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness between the wood and the frame. Her stomach twisted, her mouth dried instantly. She felt the air leave her lungs in a quiet, shaky breath. The dog sat in front of the door, not touching it, not pawing at it, simply sitting, as though he had nudged it by accident or brushed against it while shifting position. His ears were relaxed, his posture calm. Nothing intentional, nothing extraordinary. Just a moment that had happened, because the world had continued moving even when she hadn't. Her first instinct was to rush forward and slam it shut. Seal it again. Pretend it hadn't happened. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, as though urging her to do exactly that, but her feet stayed planted. The dog turned his head toward her, soft eyes blinking once, slowly, not urging, not expecting, just present. She stepped forward, each movement stiff. The small gap of darkness seemed to widen as she approached, though she knew it didn't. Her hand hovered in the air, suspended between closing the door and pulling it open. She felt an ache expand in her chest, deep and warm, almost suffocating. She pressed her palm to the wood. It was cold. Her hand trembled as her fingers curled around the brass handle, the familiar shape sending a shock of memory through her. She swallowed, eyes burning with the effort not to collapse. She didn't pull. She didn't push. She just held the handle and let her forehead rest against the door. Her breathing hitched. She felt her chest tighten in slow, tightening pulses. The dog stood and stepped closer, pressing the side of his body against her shin. She didn't look at him, but the contact steadied her. Her grip loosened. Her hand slipped downward, falling to her side. She stepped back, shaking uncontrollably, and let her body sink onto the edge of the bed. Her elbows rested on her knees, her hands covering her face as she tried to steady the quivering breaths. The closet door remained ajar, that thin sliver of darkness visible from where she sat. She couldn't look at it directly, but she could feel its presence, less threatening now, more like a wound exposed to air for the first time. Eventually she lay down on the bed, turning away from the door, the dog curling against her legs. She kept one hand on his fur, fingers tangled gently, her breathing slowly aligning with his steady rhythm. She didn't close the door. She couldn't open it. Not yet. But she let it stay the way it was, slightly open, allowing the faintest edge of memory to breathe into the room. And somewhere in the quiet of that nearly dark space, something inside her shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first slow loosening of a knot she'd been pulling tight for months. The door remained half open through the night, an unintentional gesture that hovered at the edge of her awareness, even as exhaustion pulled her into sleep. She woke before dawn, her body stiff, her mind caught in that hazy place between memory and the present. The dog lay curled near her feet, rising the moment she shifted, stretching silently before settling beside the bed, as if waiting for her to decide what this morning would become. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling into her lap. The air in the room felt still, carrying a faint chill that seeped into her skin. She turned her head, expecting the closet door to be shut again, as though the world might have quietly undone what happened the day before. But it remained exactly as she had left it, open just an inch, a slim offering of darkness softened by the early light. Her stomach tightened. She pressed her fingers to her collarbone, grounding herself in the gentle pressure. The dog moved toward the door, but instead of sitting beside it, he lay down a short distance away, resting his head on his paws. His posture felt calmer than before, as if something had shifted in him too, or perhaps in the space between them. She rose to her feet and stood there for a long moment. The sock on the nightstand caught her eye, small and folded over itself, carrying a weight that felt different now. Not sharp, not frightening, just honest. She picked it up almost without thinking, the fabric warm from the faint sunlight drifting through the window. She held it loosely, her fingers smoothing the worn heel. The house was quiet as she walked down the hallway. Her steps felt steadier than the days before, though they carried the same tension. She made tea she didn't drink, filling the mug with hot water simply because the ritual steadied her veins. The dog followed her from room to room, not with urgency but with the soft determination of a creature who had learned her rhythm. By mid-morning the light brightened, pale and wintry. She stood in the living room staring out at the frost on the yard, her breath slowing as she tried to calm the unease inside her. For weeks her world had narrowed to avoid a single door. Now everything in the house seemed to orbit that point again, but differently, less like a threat, more like a truth she had finally stopped running from. She eventually walked back toward the bedroom, the sock still in her hand. The dog moved at her side, his presence a steadying weight. When they reached the room, he stopped just behind her, sitting quietly as though sensing she needed space. She stood before the closet door again. No trembling, no immediate urge to flee, just a quiet, trembling awareness that the moment she had spent months avoiding was finally reaching toward her with slow, patient gravity. Her fingers touched the wood first, then the brass handle. This time she didn't pull away. Her breath thickened, rising slowly in her chest. Her hand tightened, not in panic, but in readiness. She pulled the door open. It moved with a soft, reluctant creak, revealing a darkness that wasn't threatening, just untouched. The faint scent of cedar drifted out, carrying with it the remnants of a life that had ended too abruptly to be packed away gently. She stepped forward, the dog remaining behind her, still but watchful. Inside the closet, everything was exactly as it had been the day she closed it. His jackets hanging neatly, his shirts arranged by color the way he always wanted, the old hiking boots resting against the far wall. Dust had settled in thin, almost delicate layers, as though time had been holding its breath alongside her. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She reached for the first jacket, her fingers brushing the fabric lightly. The texture shocked her, familiar, warm, lived in. She gripped it, pulling it toward her, the weight of it settling across her hands like the memory of an embrace she had tried too hard to forget. Her body folded forward before she realized she was moving. She pressed her face into the fabric, her shoulders shaking as the grief she had kept locked behind this door finally surged through the cracks she could no longer hold shut. The sound that escaped her was not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet exhale breaking under the weight of everything she had been carrying. She didn't collapse onto the floor. She didn't drown in the moment. She simply stood there, shaking, breathing, letting the truth she had spent months avoiding rest against her chest. The dog moved then just a few steps, sitting beside her but not touching her. His presence grounded her without intruding, offering warmth without reaching for her pain. She reached down with one trembling hand and let her fingers brush his fur. He leaned gently against her leg, steady and patient. She stayed there for a long time, long enough for her breathing to settle, long enough for the trembling to fade, long enough to feel the jacket grow warm in her hands. When she finally stepped back, she folded the jacket over her arm and closed the closet door. Not to shut it away, but to acknowledge that she had opened it, that she could open it again. The door clicked softly, a sound that didn't feel like an end, but like a continuation. She placed the jacket on the bed and sat beside it, running her hand once more along the fabric. The dog curled at her feet, his head resting near her ankle. She felt the weight of the past settle in her chest, not as something crushing, but as something she could carry now, something she had finally allowed herself to touch. The house felt different, not lighter, not healed, just honest. She inhaled slowly, letting the air fill her lungs in a way it hadn't in months. The silence around her no longer echoed. It simply existed, the way all truths do when they finally stop hiding. She sat there for a long time, her hand resting on the jacket, the dog breathing softly beside her. And in that still, quiet moment, she let herself accept the simple, undeniable truth. She was still here, and she could continue. If this story touched you, stay with us for the next one.